division between workers and employers and its impact on firm value creation. So I'm particularly excited about this panel, not only because this topic is very dear to my heart, but also because I think we're at a point where there's actually an opportunity for a lot of really interesting and important research questions opening up again. Of course, the division of surplus between workers and shareholders has been a central topic in strategy research, as well as in economics, sociology, and social sciences beyond as well. And as a result, we have a wealth of understanding already about these processes and these outcomes. But in recent decades, we've seen some really important shifts in technology, in economic policy, as well as the decline in labor unionization across various economies that have actually led to some very important changes in the process of bargaining, as well as in the outcomes between labor and capital. And so the goal of today's panel is to introduce our panelists of four very prominent researchers whose work has actually contributed greatly to our understanding of both these processes and these outcomes. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Matthew Bidwell, Jerry Davis, Connie Helfat, and Lamar Pierce. Thank you very much. We're very honored and grateful for you to join us today to share your thoughts on this important topic. So the agenda for today is quite simple. We're going to spend the first hour or so on panelist presentations. Each panelist will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on this subject, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience and broader discussion. In terms of basic housekeeping, what we'll do is we'll use the chat box primarily for questions and comments during the speakers' sessions, but also afterwards. But during the discussion, please do feel free to raise your hand and we'll have a livelier discussion that way. I will moderate the chat and help the speakers also collate the comments and questions and keep time for speakers. So I'll give you a 5-minute and 1-minute warning up to the 15-minute mark. So I don't want to take any more time. I want to give the floor to our speakers and we'll just go in order. So Matthew, please go ahead. The floor is yours and you have 15 minutes.
Great. Okay, let me see if I can share my screen.
Stop sharing.
Stop slideshow. Okay, can you see this?
Perfect.
Great. So first of all, thank you very much to Victoria and Alenka for organizing this panel on a very important topic. So delighted to be here. Whether you'll be delighted I'm here, we'll decide in about 15 minutes. So Alenka and Victoria did ask me specifically to kind of talk about mobility. And so that's what I'm going to focus on this talk. I've got a few kind of broader thoughts on kind of thinking about surplus division, in particularly kind of labor surplus in strategy towards the end there. So why talk about mobility in the context of surplus? I mean, if you think about how labor captures value from the organization, there are basically three options. So one option is obviously collective bargaining. And that used to be a very important tool, like the threat of strikes really focuses the mind. These days, it is almost impossible to unionize a new establishment in the US. The failure of I can't remember which union it was to unionize the Amazon plant in Alabama is a great example. So that's not a great way anymore that labor captures surplus. So what are we left with? So you can bargain when you enter the firm. And so kind of mobility into the firm is a great point to kind of say, okay, here's how much I want. You know, if you're writing economic models, you would imagine then that potentially you write some complex contract about, you know, making sure you capture all the surplus over your time at the firm. We don't tend to see complex contracts like that. I think probably partly just the inherent uncertainty and incontractability of so much in employment. Probably also various aspects of the fact we have employment at will where either party can break the contract at any point. Between the two, you know, we don't see a lot. So there's some value capture when you come in. And so then how do workers bargain beyond that? And it is the threat of exit, job mobility. So mobility is a really central piece of value capture. It's worth just looking at kind of, you know, how much mobility is there? And the answer is, in some ways, surprisingly little, particularly if you kind of read some of the more dramatic things written about the labour market. So these are figures from the US labour market. Remember that the US is seen, at least among kind of Western economies, as having the most mobile labour market. But when people are in kind of their prime working years, obviously as I get older, my view of what the prime working years are kind of gradually shifts to the right. But you're seeing kind of figures of, average tenure of 5 years, age 35 to 44, moving up towards 8 years. And so people don't actually move all that much. And so kind of capturing value when you come into the organization, there's less of that. Threat of mobility may be still a major point. It's worth pointing out, obviously, these things are changing. There is a strong perception that, particularly among my MBA students, that everybody is so much more mobile than they used to be. It really depends on how you define used to be. And so there was a big shift in mobility during the 80s and 90s. There hasn't been much of a big shift since about 2000. In fact, if anything, people say probably mobility has gone down slightly. Clearly, there's something very strange going on at the moment. And so this kind of post-COVID reorganization of the economy, we are seeing a lot of mobility. It's an interesting question. As we see more mobility, does that mean workers are capturing more value then? And it's kind of, I guess, short-term versus long-term. So yes, I think employers at the moment are very annoyed about having to raise wages as you have to compete more in the labour market. So there's a greater threat of mobility. It does give workers an opportunity to capture value. On the other hand, I think the fact that so many workers are moving tells you something about how little surplus they're capturing, right? The workers who are not mobile tend to be those who are in organizations that are sharing a lot of value with them. And in fact, the kind of decline of mobility that we saw during the 80s and 90s, I found was strongly associated with declines in unionization. And so I think, we see a lot of mobility because firms don't share a lot of surplus. And so as a worker, I'm reasonably indifferent between staying where I am and going to the next organization. The other thing, just to point out briefly on this topic, and probably I suspect many of the people here are very familiar with this idea, that the threat of mobility is important for getting employers to cough up money, but it far from ensures that employers pay exactly what the worker's worth. And so there's all this literature on firm-specific skills, which I think is a big constraint. That when people work at a firm, they develop a lot of knowledge, almost, I think, without intentionally investing in it. They develop a lot of knowledge around, what are the processes, what are the routines, what's the culture, relationships with all those sorts of people that are important for doing their jobs. Those aren't transferable, and so they can't really persuade other employers to pay for those skills. And so that creates a wedge between what they're worth to other employers and the current employer, and that wedge is something that the current employer can probably grab. Big deal or small deal, how does this work out in practice? So I've got a paper from a number of years ago just comparing hired and promoted workers, and that actually gives you a sense, right? So we find that the promoted workers perform much better because of these firm-specific skills, but get paid significantly less than the hired workers. And so if we think about what the hired workers are getting paid as kind of the, representing some version of the employer's willingness to pay, you see that the workers who are performing better than that willingness to pay are still getting paid a bunch less. And so it does suggest there is this wedge going on around firm-specific skills that employers are able to capture. So unlike, I think, almost everybody else, actually no, I forgot Jerry. Jerry's here. So most people at SMS, it's like, how can firms capture more value? My take tends to be, how can workers capture more value? And so looking at this, it does suggest that, maybe workers should move around more, that when workers are moving around more, they're capturing more of the value. We see these highly mobile workers getting paid more. It's actually not clear that that's the case. So relatively, yes, I think they're capturing more of the value of what they're worth to the organization, but there are declines in value creation, which means they may be capturing or they may be capturing more of a smaller pie. And so, for example, we've got another study where we just look, actually Wharton MBA alumni, who gets paid more, the people who move firms more or the people who stick in firms. And actually, we didn't see that people who are moving firms more were getting paid more in the long run. I think partly because it slows down their rate of promotion. And so there is this issue that I think, workers can capture more of a smaller pie by moving, but actually those firm-specific skills are actually quite valuable. And so staying in organization, building those firm-specific skills works out often being better for the workers, even if it works out being even better for the organizations. So yes, when it comes to mobility, I think employers still win. I want to just close with a couple of thoughts. So having said that, great topic. Surplus division, I think, has been really central to research on strategic human capital, because of this point that they are one of the few resources that can capture most of the value that they create. And so we've seen a lot of it. I do wonder if we ought to be a little bit more specific about which jobs we're talking about and where it tends to be important. There's a couple of thoughts here. So one is just, we've been doing some research with Federica De Stefano, who is at HSA, using some great data she has on Italian restaurants. We've been using that using worker mobility across restaurants to estimate both value creation and value capture. And what we see is there's vast differences in value creation. So the most productive workers, sort of kind of each standard deviation increase in value creation is worth about 6% of profits, or about double the worker's salary. And so you see kind of different workers creating, the best managers creating way more value for the organization. We see tiny differences in how much they're actually paid. And so in this context, good workers aren't capturing more value. Now, I think it's different if you look at, say, fund managers, if you look at salespeople, if you look maybe at CEOs, where they're just a lot more visible. I think their value capture is a really big deal. But I think in a lot of these less visible roles, that actually having good people, because it's so hard for anybody to know exactly how much value any one person is creating, value capture may be less of a constraint on organizational performance. And so in that case, thinking a little bit more about value creation through human capital will be valuable. The other thing, and this comes very much from writing this paper and writing it to a strategy audience, and it's all about, okay, so what does this tell us about how firms can capture more surplus? And I'm thinking, is this really the question that I want to be answering? Is my concern that Jeff Bezos doesn't have enough money? And so I do wonder slightly beyond just whether value capture in many roles is telling us enough about the source of performance. I think our focus on value capture is also kind of defined by a particular, dare I say, neoliberal view of what firm performance is, really equating it with shareholder value. If you start taking more stakeholder value orientation, then what you're interested in firm performance is the total value being created. And I do think, we've seen kind of neoliberal turn, yada, yada. Organizations have totally bought into this whole, it's all about shareholder value. But I'm more interested in definitions of firm performance, where we're really thinking about what is it that makes this firm a viable concern, and what makes it produce better goods, be more flexible, and all those sorts of things than other organizations. So yeah, the more I work on this, the more this focus on value division makes me slightly uncomfortable. I will stop there. So I see, shall I just try and answer the questions in the window, or do people want to put up hands? What works?
Okay, we have a couple minutes still. So if you'd like to take a couple questions now, and then 15 minutes.
Okay, and then I can answer the ones in chat. Lamar.
Yeah. So I love this emphasis that you have on. Well, I love your point on being uncomfortable about value division, because I feel that way as well. And I'm curious, why do you think it is that, at least within the field of strategy and this idea of strategic human capital, that everyone is so focused on this idea of the division of value, but between labor and capital? I mean, it sort of struck me that people have lost sight of this idea of creating value, like what makes more productive, and instead is like, this Gary Becker idea of like who ends up with the division. We seem to be stuck there. And why do you think we are? Well, I don't know. Maybe you don't think we are, but
I mean, I think it. I think it's because of the way that partly we define organizational performance. And I think it's, if you start with this view that labor will, you have to pay workers their marginal productivity, then you very quickly get into this world of, well, if we have to pay workers on marginal productivity, then we can't get competitive advantage from hiring better workers. We can only get competitive advantage from figuring out how to capture more value from workers. And so I think it's a very interesting theoretical move, right? And kind of Ruskoff and others kind of, I think it was a very neat point that actually you need to think a lot about value capture if you're thinking about performance. But yes, my sense is intellectually very smart, very neat. Do I like where it's driven us as a field? I'm less sure about that. Alenka?
Sure. So there's a quick question, Matthew. This is very interesting. I was particularly interested by something you mentioned, which was that within those Italian restaurants, you saw that especially those who are not visible were less likely to capture the surplus. And so I just wondered, do you have any sense of whether firms would strategically block or reduce workers' visibility to capture more surplus? Because I recall reading something about it in mutual funds, but I was curious if, this could be something that's going on more broadly in terms of firms trying to reduce bargaining power outside options by just making these workers less visible.
I mean, there's a lot of research. So there are some nice theories of promotion. I think Mike Waldman, I'm sure other people can correct me on this, who kind of points out that when you promote people, you put a big sticker on their back saying this person's a high performer, which enables them to bargain up their wages. And so that actually can then affect your promotion decisions. I think Itai Stern and has some work. Does Uliot Solomon as well, looking at kind of when organizations make their managers more visible and how that can affect value capture. So yes, I think there have been some interesting things there. In some ways, the visibility that we're looking at, so this isn't so much they're deliberately making them less visible, it was just if you're manager of a store, figuring out how much of the value you're creating is you, how much is the store, how much is random fluctuations. That's actually quite a hard problem. It took us a long time messing around with Stata to get there, and most organizations just don't put in the effort. And so I think it's more, and we kind of get back to causal ambiguity. How much value do I create for the University of Pennsylvania? I hope nobody ever tries to figure it out. I worry about what the answer might be, but let's be honest, nobody knows, right? And so I think given that, how this bargaining actually works, and so we just end up with kind of pay scales and rules of thumb because it's so hard to figure out. So I think at that point, kind of, given we have no idea, making this strong assumption that I'm going to capture all the value I create. So, yeah, really.
All right, thank you so much. I think we have to unfortunately move on. So, Jerry, would you like to share your screen? But please go ahead and answer. There's a bunch of questions also in the chat, and I can help moderate.
All right. Thank you so much. I really want to thank Victoria and Olenka for inviting me to the SM Society. I don't normally hang out with strategy people, and I've never cared in the slightest about firm performance. So this is an exciting shift for me to actually be speaking to a crowd that does care. And what I'm going to talk about is really about ontology and regulation, which sounds psychedelic, but it'll all make sense in the fullness of time. So here's a fun sentence for you. And I can verify that this is a comprehensible English sentence, and I know what this sentence means, which is weird. Now imagine trying to explain this to someone in 1990 before the web, memes, smartphones, apps, and cryptocurrency existed. And now imagine explaining it to the 1890 US Congress that passed the Sherman Act. And that's kind of the situation that we're in now in trying to think about the nature of corporate power and how you divide the spoils among different stakeholders. Is the categories that we've traditionally used to understand the economy are kind of falling apart. And so the big themes of this talk and my recent work have been about how ICTs have transformed the constituent markets of the corporation And this ends up undermining basic categories like employee and firm and industry and size and nationality. And specifically, the pandemic and the changes that it's accelerated in the restaurant industry show what this might look like for firms and jobs in the future. So the short version of everything I've done in the last 30 years is on this one slide here. So ICTs have drastically lowered the transaction costs for accessing factor markets for corporations. Lamar, thank you for not changing your name to Oliver Williamson. Turns out he was right after all. First is financialization, the increasing centrality and accessibility of financial markets, Nikification, outsourcing production to suppliers. Amazon, which is outsourcing distribution, and most recently, Uberization, the use of online spot markets for labor at all levels, not just getting a ride to the airport, but emergency room physicians and all kinds of other occupations. And the claim is that I would make is as a result of this, the components to create an enterprise are kind of like a pile of Legos sitting on the floor waiting to be assembled. So if you have a pile of Legos, then you too can create the Instant Pot, which is a $300 million category. They sell 300,000 of these things on Amazon's Prime Day alone, but the company only had 50 employees in Ottawa, Canada, and outsourced all of the rest. Ottawa, by the way, is a capital and not Toronto for anyone who's actually visiting their home and native land for this panel. So we're in this weird situation where anybody can snap together a firm from all of these available parts. And the pandemic has really accelerated our reliance on platforms of various forms to access the outside world. This is a metaphor for screens that now stand between us and the outside world. We only know what's going on through a set of screens. So that's my metaphor for the day. This has turned out to be great news for 5 companies in particular, which now make up 1/3 of the value of the S&P 500. 1/3 of the value of my pension fund is resting on 5 corporations that people on the left and right all want to break up. Me too, but this is a little bit spooky that so much of our wealth is dependent on a handful of neo-monopolists. But it's possibly less great for the rest of us, and those of you who watch Black Mirror every day to remind themselves of the world we're living in know what I'm saying here. So I lived in Silicon Valley last year in Menlo Park. I used to ride my bike past Sheryl Sandberg's house every day on the way to and from the office and pass by her security guard sitting in white SUVs. And the first weekend we were there in Menlo Park, it was 104 degrees. And we had an unhealthy air quality. I looked up the air quality index and it was over 150 and it said, don't leave the house. The following Wednesday, this is an actual picture of what San Francisco looked like because of the wildfires that happen all over California. And so we literally couldn't leave the house. Our knowledge of the world came entirely through apps. Well, a homebound population is bad news for restaurants. In fact, 100,000 restaurants closed in the first 6 months of the pandemic, which is sort of like the meteor that hit the earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and then opened up space for the mammals. And so the question is, what are the mammals going to look like? Employment in the US restaurant industry had a really crazy time here. It tends to go up. And then in 1 month, employment in restaurants dropped in the US, dropped by the population of Denmark. That's a lot. I know Denmark's small, but 5 million jobs is a lot to lose in a month. And it crept back up, but not in the way that we necessarily expected. Restaurants are very resilient. You see this photo of Pompeii, and it turns out that restaurants have been around at least since Roman times. What a lot of people didn't realize about this one was it was an olive garden. But what restaurants did to deal with this situation is, all right, no one's going to walk into our doors, but we can switch to takeout. And luckily for them, there's now a whole lot of different delivery companies like Grubhub and Deliveroo and so on that will bring food to your home. I lived in New York for a few years when I was teaching at Columbia University, and 6 nights out of 7, delivery people would bring the food. So my son, the toddler, would say, "Daddy, what's the food guy bringing tonight?" Now, thanks to Grubhub and DoorDash, everybody in the world, at least in the US, has this same experience. And if their kids are brats and only want to eat buttered noodles, they can order from 4 different restaurants and it all shows up at their door, which is great. On the internet, nobody knows your Chuck E. Cheese. So if the only thing that people know about the restaurant is a menu that they find online, which might not actually be the menu that the restaurant itself promulgates, then Chuck E. Cheese can kind of slide through in disguise and call themselves Pasquale's Pizza and Wings and get the food delivered to people, say, "Oh, a new local restaurant, Pasquale's has just opened," and not realize that their food is being made by rodents somewhere at the Chuck E. Cheese restaurant behind some kind of children's birthday party. Well, of course, restaurants are very clever about this, and they switched to a kind of virtual restaurant model, which is we don't have to just cook for one flavor of restaurant here in our premises. We can start cooking for other restaurants. We are a Malaysian restaurant, but we can also cook fried chicken sandwiches, which happened at a place 2 blocks from my house in Menlo Park. Like, it doesn't, a kitchen is very interoperable for the most part. Well, this introduced an interesting new sort of quasi-industry, which is the universal commissary kitchen. So after Travis Kalanick was fired from Uber and moved on to his new industry, his new business is called Cloud Kitchens, and it's commissary kitchens where they will provide the capital equipment and you can open up, they claim, in a month. You don't have to buy the restaurant or rent anything. You move in and it's sort of an available kitchen where you can do your work in their sort of commissary kitchen. DoorDash is now doing them one better. DoorDash has now opened ghost kitchens where they will do the actual ordering and food preparation. So restaurants bring their brands and recipes, and DoorDash handles the rest, sourcing ingredients, cooking food, taking online orders, and delivering them to customers, which is wild. If you can come up with so much like if you have a phone recipe, you can get Foxconn to create it for you. If you have a set of delicious homemade Polish foods, you can open a restaurant today, send the recipe, which is basically food prep algorithms, send the recipe to DoorDash and they will make it and deliver it. Super interesting. Well, what can we expect when this becomes a technological, a cost-effective possibility? You'll have one facility that's cooking for many different restaurants. A restaurant will just be a menu, which is a set of food preparation algorithms bound together by a brand. You will see IKEA-like instructions on screens in the kitchen for the assembly of menu items. It'll basically walk them through the procedure of how to make whatever it is that you have on the menu. Competitive advantage is going to go to menu designers who can create readily assembled menu items that people actually want. Cheesecake Factory does this. They have entire laboratories that create foods that are reasonably easy to assemble that people actually like, and then they bottle the instructions and send it out to their restaurant. And I think we're going to see increasing standardization of jobs so that it'll be much easier to recruit people. You want the most interoperable labor force that you can, and I think we're going to see a lot more reliance on temps. This is already happening. There's an app called Paired and many others where restaurants can hire people by the shift. You log onto this app, they know your job history and how you're able to roast peppers using a welding torch or whatever. And you can hire on shift by shift to restaurants. So the entire workforce or large parts of it can be recruited by the day, ideally a couple of weeks in advance, but not necessarily. So I'm going to pause here to point something out. That I think will echo what Matthew was getting at earlier. I think the employment relation in the U.S. is on the verge of a vast transformation, even more that's going to be a disaster for labor. Prop 22 in California was basically the COVID of labor relations. It's a complete disaster. Look it up and read about it. Certifying that Uber drivers really are contractors and not employees. Within moments of this thing getting passed in California last November, grocery stores all over California fired all their delivery drivers and replaced them with DoorDash. And if you don't know what delivery work looks like, there's a lovely article in The Verge very recently about delivery workers in New York City and what their life looks like. I am fairly confident you would not switch your tenured faculty job for a delivery rider. It's pretty much monstrous. Well, how does the world feel about this? So platforms turn out to be valued more than firms. Yum China Holdings, which is Pizza Hut and Taco Bell and other things in China, is a very profitable company with lots of revenues and over 400,000 employees and a modest market cap. DoorDash, in contrast, is full of losses, has less than 1% of the employees of Yum, and has a market cap of $75 billion. So it's pretty clear that Wall Street likes the no employees model much more than the many employees model. It's a bad thing for labor. So weirdly, the online delivery model has now returned to the real world. During the COVID year, most sit-down restaurants started offering QR codes for people. Instead of paper menus that they thought might be germy, people scanned the QR code on their phone and the menu popped up. And it turns out that you can also, if you care to, use an app that allows you to order the food and pay for it with your credit card online. What is the advantage of a world like this? Is that it apparently reduces labor costs by 30 to 50% because you replace waiters and waitresses who say, "Hi, my name's Lamar. I'm going to be serving you tonight. I hope you're doing okay." Instead of that, you have an anonymous person hired by the shift who knows you're at table 23 and runs the food out from the kitchen and then runs back. That's a lot cheaper than charming people with social skills like Lamar. And in America, cheap wins. That is kind of the world that we live in. I mean, I'm going to go to Selden Standard because I'm rich, but normal people and graduate students, they're going to be going to the places that are using food runners that are a lot cheaper. And so you could imagine physical restaurants turning into essentially immobile food trucks. Like if you don't have a menu and you don't really have ambiance, why not change the menu every night? It could be Thai tonight and kimchi burritos tomorrow, and Szechuan the day after that. You don't really need to be tied to any particular cuisine. Well, this leaves us with a mysterious situation, which is, are these things firms? And I know the SM Society is all about firms and their performance. I heard from Jay Barney at some point. Are these things firms? Are these restaurants firms? If it's an economic organization in which private owners of capital goods hire and direct labor to produce goods and services for sale on markets to make a profit, well, if the restaurant is a menu, which is a bunch of food prep algorithms, it's being prepared by DoorDash contractors and delivered by DoorDash contractors. I mean, does a recipe count as directing labor? I am not a labor economist or a lawyer, but I'm not so sure about that. So where are the firms in this world? And of course, what is an employee? I won't read this whole thing. I will just point out that it's not just delivery riders. I mean, college professors and people operating in emergency rooms, all kinds of jobs could fairly easily be replaced by contractors recruited by the shift. And I'm not sure we're going to love this world. If we had to bid every morning or once a week for our shifts and the low bidders win because minimum wage doesn't apply to contractors, subject to a quality constraint, my rating's over 4.5 on a 5-point scale, I could be teaching Matthew's next class about the Lochner decision at a lot cheaper, for a lot cheaper than Matthew charges the University of Pennsylvania, just to be really clear here. So that's where I want to end. Dark and dystopian as usual.
Thank you so much. We're actually almost out of time. So unless there's a very, very quick question, we might move on and then come back at the end. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So up next, Connie, would you like to share your slides?
I will, but let me say a few words. First, on that cheery note, I'm going to try and say something. I'm going to switch gears to a really different topic. So let me share my slides, but you'll see in my slides, I'm going to focus on value creation and capture rather than surplus division. I think that, I come out of strategy with a strong interest in work in HR rather than the other way around. And I think that for all the issues you guys have raised, you can't capture value unless the firm creates it, right? If we're thinking about firms. So I think that that makes this whole topic quite complicated, right? And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm probably going to focus a little more on what we might call skilled workers, right? Which, whereas I think, Matthew had a mix in there, and I think Jerry was sort of focused a little more on less skilled labor. So maybe this will balance out a little bit. So with that, let me share my slides. Okay. Okay. So you guys can all see this. So here we are. So I'm not surprisingly going to think about firm capabilities. This is what I volunteered to talk about. I thought, well, this will make me think a little bit. I don't really think there's much work out there about the effect of the changing landscape of work arrangements, which is the topic of this session, on firm capabilities, right? And so I just have some high-level thoughts, and I want to think about how this might affect value creation and capture. So, this is an enormous topic. I mean, I was having trouble, like, where am I going to start? Like, what kinds of work arrangements for which types of workers and which types of companies? And I came to the view that maybe I should just try a few examples and see if I can make some progress rather than starting with sort of theory, because I tried that and I didn't get very far. So let me give you a couple examples, and we can see what we think. So I try to think of things that, like, people don't talk as much about in the literature, right? So I saw this really interesting article, like in the last couple of days in the Wall Street Journal, that just made me sit up and go, oh my goodness, I need to learn more about this. And this is semiconductor manufacturing. So it turns out that an existing sort of typical semiconductor plant requires about 100 employees to run it, right? That tells you something right there about how much work robots are doing, and just assembly lines and everything else, right? A new state-of-the-art facility, and so that's one that's going up in Austria, actually. I mean, cutting-edge technology requires 10 employees to run the same, essentially the same output, right? These are clearly skilled engineers, largely running computers. I'm assuming the manufacturing is heavily performed by robots and just assembly lines. I'd love to learn more about this technology as someone who studies technology. Well, what does this mean, right? So this is your classic substitution of capital for labor, right? But they're clearly substituting some pretty highly skilled labor here, right? And the ratio of capital to labor must be astronomical in these plants, right? So, all right, so let's think about this, right? So one thing, that comes up here is to think about the bargaining power, right, for a share of the value that's created, right? So will the workers in these state-of-the-art plants have more or less bargaining power than before? Well, from a theory point of view, it's like the same theory, right? What's the relative scarcity of the workers with the requisite skills? All these issues of whether it's firm specific or not, like additional factors like plant or firm specificity of workers' skills. And we can put some other things in here. But I think it's sort of the standard logic. It's just you need facts and empirical analysis to actually find out what some version of what the answer is, right? So I think a lot of the same theory applies, but what I'd like to know is, like, what is actually happening, how the firm's responding, how the workers respond. So that's my first example for you. Here's a question. Let's think very specifically. Now what does this mean for capability, right? Because honestly, you're going to do a whole lot better manufacturing semiconductors if you can do this reliably and with high quality, and that's what capability does for you. And organizational capabilities are underpinned by routines. They involve coordination. They involve, often problem-solving routines, because stuff comes up. You got to figure out what to do. That's part of the reason why you have the 10 workers in this plant, right? So how does this higher, what I call labor, misprint, capital labor configuration affect manufacturing routines, right? I don't know. but do we need more or less coordination among workers, right? And then is more the capability and the value creation at the individual rather than the plant level or not, right? You only have these 10 workers. What are they doing? How important are they? Does their value go up or down, right? Does the ability of individuals to capture value increase or decrease? And that, depends on what their contribution to the creation of the value is, right? Conditional on having a job. So the reason I bring this up is because I think this is actually a quite complicated issue. And it also goes to the fact that workers don't create value on their own, right? Without the assets in this plant and all the technology and knowledge that went into creating it, the workers don't matter, right? So I think you really have to think of this is quite complicated, and I don't actually know the answer. So I'm actually raising this for you guys to think about. So let me take another thing that lots of people talked about, which is software development is another example, right? So we know that some companies plan to let software developers work from home permanently, and some of them have already done this, right? So what does this imply for capability to develop software, an organizational capability? We know that software engineers often work in teams. We know they often work sometimes in geographically dispersed teams, even when the team members are in physical offices, right? So what might this imply for value creation and capture, right? There are benefits for working in teams from routines, right? Who does what, in what order? How do you coordinate, right? And there are firm-specific routines for software development. You can go into these companies and you'll see that they have somewhat different processes, right? And these routines might be particularly important in settings where engineers switch teams regularly, which happens a lot in these companies, right? So what are routines useful for? Integrating engineers into ongoing teams, configuring new teams, and this brings me to the issue of physical space again, because that was the question I started to. We know that physical space facilitates interactions and monitoring. And so I think for that reason, that when you have remote software development, these routines might be particularly important, perhaps to even help mitigate some of the disadvantages of not having the physical space, right? So, that leads me to, you'll see where I'm going, because I want to know what all this implies for value creation and capture. But, what sort of companies are likely to have routines and therefore capabilities that can be, most useful for remote software development? Well, I think established companies are more likely to have routines rather than startups. I've seen some of these startups figuring out as they go with respect to how they develop their software. Other would be companies with projects that can be more easily decomposed among engineers. They don't need to coordinate as much. They don't need that interaction with physical space. And companies where the projects for which output is a good measure of inputs, right? So due to, because you can't monitor as well without physical location, right? And not all software projects actually is output a good measure for inputs, particularly when you do something new that's extremely difficult. You may have a lot of input without much output for quite a while. So I think this actually has some implications for value creation and capture. So first of all, it's really obvious. I gave you different types of firms and projects. They're likely to differ in their work arrangements for software development in order to create as much value as possible before we even get to value capture. It's not clear to me that one approach is superior to value creation than another in these, remote versus not, different types of routines. I don't know. And it's not clear to me in this setting for remote versus non-remote work, whether engineers have more ability to extract value in one work arrangement or another. I don't know, right? I think we need more facts, right, for these kind of things. So I'm giving you these examples because I think that the worker and firm relative value creation and capture is likely to be highly context dependent, right? That the types of work and the types of non-human capital assets are likely to matter, right? And so I think what we need is actually more empirical work that tries to tease this out. And for this, I really love to see more sort of really, like context dependent studies, for this type of industry in these kinds of firms, where do we get the most value creation? And then what does this mean for value capture? And I think that would help us a lot. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So we actually have another 5 minutes. We can postpone those 5 minutes for later, or if anybody would like to ask a question now, keep it organized. So actually, maybe I can ask something quickly. So you mentioned that your focus will be on skilled labor. Do you have any thoughts on the types of skills that would also matter more or less in these contexts? So things like social skills versus more kind of skills with working with the machinery. And is there an opportunity for research?
Yeah. Well, it partly depends how much coordination you need, right? So if I can work on a plant on my own and all you need is my individual labor and I don't need much coordination, I think it depends, right? I don't know how many social skills you need to interact with a computer. You do need some to interact with your boss, but it might not be all that frequent. I think this goes to a point that I think it's really context dependent on the type of work.
Thank you. Matthew, I think you have a question.
Just a comment on your kind of initial example, which is very thought-provoking about the how few people there now are working in the semiconductor facility. It does strike me when I look at these hugely capital-intensive semiconductor plants that in some ways the source of competitive advantage, the routines and all of that sort of thing have shifted, but actually running a semiconductor plant is not very interesting. Building one is actually kind of where all the action is. And so I kind of wonder if kind of when we think about competitive advantage in that sense and kind of value capture, we need to start shifting away from kind of the day-to-day operations of the plant and more to, which companies are actually able to put these together.
I think I stayed away from that because I didn't have any information about that that I could share. But I think it's a huge issue, and these are knowledge workers, right? So then that's one of the reasons why I took the software engineers, who are actually creating something new as opposed to people running the plants. So yes, I think we need to look at that, particularly for competitive advantage, even just for staying current. I mean, if the state of the art of these new facilities, you need to be able to design them or work with designers, right? I don't know if all the semiconductor plant firms are actually designing their own fabs. Maybe not.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll save the last couple of minutes for later. And so last but not least, Lamar Pierce. Please.
All right. Let me see if I can get this right today. All right, great. So thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. So I want to talk about what I see as a trend in work, and this is kind of a technology trend, but I think it has the possibility to dramatically shape the way we think about labor and society. And I kind of come from the standpoint of Matthew, which is, I'm not really a strategic human capital person, and I don't tend to think about sort of this division of value all the time. I think a lot more about the creation of value, or more specifically, think about productivity and how we create. But one of the things that's been really troubling me recently has been this idea that firms are increasingly getting the tools and the capabilities to watch every single thing that employees do. And this strikes me as not just a new technology in the workplace. This strikes me as something that could fundamentally shift what it means to work, and whether it's as an employer or a contractor. Just as an example, so I was doing an interview with a journalist a few months ago, and they asked me about this new Amazon policy for worker wellness, where they created these pods and workers could go there and relax for 15 minutes and recharge. And I said to the journalist, I'm like, you realize that Amazon has trackers and biometrics on all these people, and I guarantee you that they are recording exactly how often people go to relax, and that is probably for them a performance metric. And the reality of it is that firms are really able to follow everything that employees do these days, and that has a lot of big implications. I want to talk about that. I wish I could say I had the answers, but at least I hope we will start thinking more about this issue at work. All right. So a lot of this is motivated originally from a couple of papers, one of which I wrote, which was not the first one. So you could say I got my idea from someone else. But Ethan Bernstein had this really nice paper using a field experiment on looking at what happens when you strictly monitor employees and how this changes their productivity. And in his case, particularly innovativeness. And he found that this was wrong. That this was basically a bad thing to constantly monitor what employees do because you basically restrict their ability to innovate. I did a different paper which looked at a very different type of monitoring, which was theft monitoring in restaurants. So everybody studies restaurants, evidently. And what we found was actually a good thing, which is that when you monitor theft, you actually get more productivity as well. And I remember being interviewed about this paper after it came out. This is actually on All Things Considered. And I was asked the same question I get asked all the time about this, which is, do you think that employee surveillance is a good thing? And the point I made, and I think this is highly relevant and what we still don't know the answer to is, it's not about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And it's not about like surveillance. It's really about what are the appropriate ways of monitoring, because we've always been monitoring in the workplace. And more specifically, what's the right way to do it? And the answer to that is an entire field in and of itself. And honestly, it's something we aren't studying enough. And I'd hope that at least at the end of this talk, that you'll feel like we should be doing more of this. That was not me, by the way. So just to give you a little framework of how I think about this theoretically, this comes from my training in economics, is that, firms use a combination of policies to improve worker performance. So, they use, here on the left, they use management, right? They use managerial oversight to think about, monitoring and making sure that employees, are doing the right thing and helping them out. And it doesn't have to be a nefarious thing. In fact, in most cases, it isn't. But we've always had supervisors, we've always had managers. And, they also tend to use what we think of as incentives or things to motivate. And, that's always been the case as well. And these have kind of been traditionally in economics, the kind of key levers that we think about. But if you break this down into a framework, what we think is that worker productivity and performance is a function of their ability, which is, of course, dynamic and innovation and learning and all these things along those lines. And then also their effort, right? And their effort comes from both what we think of in like formal rational economic models, but all the things we know in psychology and sociology about what else motivates people. And then also there's production technology. And, from some combination of these three things, you get performance. But there are a lot of different ways to get performance as different combinations of this. And part of what I want to talk about is this idea that how we get performance has shifted a lot. It's continuing to shift, and this has much larger implications. Another important part of this is that this ends up helping shape culture, because culture becomes very, very important for performance as well. But it's often a very, very complicated thing to engineer. But it certainly gets shifted by the way that we use these previous different levers. Now, it used to be that monitoring was really costly and inefficient. So one of the reasons that we didn't have constant surveillance of employees in most situations is it's really expensive to have managers who constantly follow people around and watch them. And it's also quite demotivational. And so, firms in general just didn't monitor heavily. They used a lot of other ways to do this, which is, performance evaluation and incentives, and of course, culture to shape intrinsic and pro-social motivation. But this is shifting, because you don't need to have managers fooling around and watching people anymore. Now you have constant technology-based monitoring or surveillance. And this can be everything from watching what people are doing on their computer, which is particularly relevant for remote work. But it could also have to do with this idea of, wearing body sensors, or in Amazon's cases, having precise tracking devices. And these are all getting fed into into analytics systems that are constantly measuring and evaluating performance. And the problem with this is that when you do this, management fundamentally doesn't understand what is a reasonable level of effort and what is a reasonable way to push people. And it also changes the nature of management and employees. And so what this is kind of doing, and you see this all the time in firms, and there are lots of companies that are creating technology tools for this, is it creates this panopticon, right, which is this idea of people constantly being watched. And it completely shifts the relationship between management and employees. But I would even go further to say between capital and labor. It shifts this idea of, okay, do we have a relationship, a work relationship, versus do we have a strict hierarchy and essentially a dictation of what people should be doing at every moment. And one of the big costs of this is it also changes culture. It changes culture in all of the society, but also in the workplace, right? I mean, you see this polarization like we have all over the place in society. But you have the people who say, look, this isn't a bad thing, and you're a wimp if you think that employees should be constantly monitored to make sure they're performing. And then you have the other people on the side who say any monitoring or surveillance is bad because we should trust employees fully and give them warm hugs, right? You have these extremes, and the answer is always somewhere in the middle. And we'd like to reduce that type of polarization. The thing I worry about with this type of surveillance is that when you're a manager and you are watching data pour in real time and having performance metrics be spit out, and people are remote, so you don't see them, you stop thinking about people as humans. And that tends to make you think of them more as, another form of capital rather than simply as, human labor. And this is problematic, right? And this is probably why I'm getting really uncomfortable with this idea of using the term human capital. And human capital has a lot of different meanings. It goes back to Picou, who certainly didn't mean it in a nefarious way. But then you go to like Fisher, who is a eugenicist, right? And then, Gary Becker, who is a brilliant economist, but certainly we don't, I think, want to view the world like Gary Becker did back then, because he certainly thought of it in an antiquated way. And so, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean and how does it change the way we think about people if we're constantly thinking about them and using the terminology of human capital? Because, language matters. And it does shape the way we're thinking about this. So, how do managers think about what a living wage is or what a reasonable wage or effort is when they're thinking about people as streams of data rather than thinking about them as actual personalities they interact with on a different in a different way? And I got to put up Karl Marx. Karl Marx has been pretty demonized, I think, and thought of as like this, bad philosopher who had failed policies. I mean, his systems didn't seem to work out well as they were interpreted. But, he was a brilliant economist in his understanding of this tension between labor and capital. And you can see I spelled capital correctly. It's this idea that, we need to actually think about where, as Matthew pointed out, like where a lot of the gains in the quality of work come from. It's very easy to forget the 19th century, 18th century and before, that work was just awful. It was like awful. People were chained to machines. Kids were climbing up smokestacks. And that change was not entirely an issue, and the improvements in that was not entirely an issue of like capitalism advancing, that there actually was some nature of revolution that came to that, the big labor movements, and those were actually really important in changing the way this is viewed. So I worry that this creates more of a divide between labor and capital, and we get back to a point of somewhat revolution. And I think what Jerry was talking about in terms of the changing nature of restaurants and also Matthew, I think this idea of what do we see in terms of how labor is experiencing now. In the United States, you probably all know that we have a great labor shortage. Why is that? Well, a lot of people are claiming this is because we have too many unemployment benefits. But what really seems to be going on is that people, because they had this discontinuity in their work life from COVID, they got laid off, they got made remote. They've had time to reevaluate actually what the relationship is between their pay and the quality of their labor. And what I suspect is we're going to see some big changes in how people think about whether or not a crappy job for not much pay is worth it. And I'm hoping that this will create some systemic change in terms of what's expected in terms of work conditions. I think one other thing we have to ask too, and I want to emphasize at the margin here, is how important are efficiency and profits at the margin? Because efficiency and profits are important, and particularly efficiency. If you think about efficiency in farming in sub-Saharan Africa, Like improvements in efficiency are really important for human welfare. But the question is, how much is a 1% efficiency improvement at Amazon worth for society? And my guess is probably negative value. And well, I'm almost certain negative value, but then again, maybe I'm too leftist. And then we ask ourselves, how do we make trade-offs? How should we make trade-offs between the quality of life and the absolute efficiency of our operations? So really what I want to leave you with is this idea that, I think particularly this technology-based shift toward employee surveillance and the disconnect between capital and labor just needs a lot more work done. I've been surprised that there hasn't been a lot more empirical work since, those ancient papers we wrote on surveillance. There has been some. This is a really nice thought piece by the excellent Melissa Valentine. And I think what it really emphasizes to me is that we need lots more people out there trying to do very, very high quality empirical work, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, to understand how this really, all these new technology systems for surveillance are changing the nature of work. They're changing motivation, changing wages, quality of life, because I think that's probably a harbinger of what we're going to see as a societal shift in what it means to work and what it means to employ people in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Any quick questions? So we actually are at the end and we have some time for a general discussion as well. So perhaps I can quickly jump in. So to Lamar, actually, so super interesting talk, and I completely agree with you that we should have more empirical work on this. I was wondering if you have a sense of how this actually applies across maybe the skill spectrum or across different industries. Because I've also had some conversations with managers at tech firms managing software engineers, and they would say that they also, now that everybody's remote, have a lot of metrics that they can collect because everything is online. But despite that wealth of data, they don't necessarily know how to use it, or also worry about misinterpreting those results, or perhaps also how it would affect the company culture. And so there's sort of a desire, I suppose, to use some of that information, even to improve productivity and even sell that information back to, or not sell, but give the information back to employees for their own sake. But there's just kind of a lack of understanding of how to go about it. Is this also your sense of this industry, or perhaps any other thoughts on how this applies more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And I think, what I was talking about here is kind of a broader generalization, but I think as you get into the heterogeneity of different occupations and different groups in terms of, not only what we think of as their skill set, but also in terms of just like their power and status in society, you get very different effects. And I'll tell you one thing, which is that, I've never seen managers get fancy new tools that didn't want to use as much as possible. I mean, it's kind of like police forces in the United States after, we invaded Iraq, which obviously did not work out well. They got all this surplus military equipment. And what does a police force do when you give them surplus military equipment? They're going to use it, right? They bring out their, all of their military equipment, and suddenly we have very militarized police. It's the same thing with managers, right? You give them, complex ways to watch everything about, their employees, and they're like, ooh, this is fun, and they spy on them. So I think there is a big concern that, as we get more technology, there's going to be this choice to do it. And I think that applies across the broader spectrum. Now, I think the big difference between, say, the software engineer example and say the Amazon warehouse worker is again, not to sound like a unionist again, but is basically the power of labor. And in software, look, my friends and I have a software company, right? Like if the software engineers tell you that they want a pink coffee maker, you give them a pink coffee maker because they will walk out the door and find another job in a heartbeat. They have the power to do that. And so I think, firms will be much more careful about that. But I think in a lot of occupations, as workers get commoditized, they don't have any power. And so they will not be able to push back against this. So I think you're right. I think you have to evaluate this in every different occupation, different skill set. But I would argue that software engineers are a dramatic exception rather than a rule. And I would argue that they will become much more commoditized as well once software is able to write software itself, which is already happening.
Thanks so much. Brett?
Yeah, hi. I suppose this is a question for Lamar. Two observations here. Number one, a lot of occupations are really unhealthy, right? I mean, I think about ours, right? We sit at our screens for, long stretches at a time. Not good for us, right? And certainly a lot of other occupations, particularly in a pandemic, you put your health on the line. The second observation is fitness. The way the fitness industry has changed because of monitoring. So I think about Orange Theory and getting sort of the ideal heart rate, and we have these things on our wrists that monitor our heart, all kinds of things, right? About what we do activity wise on an hour to hour, minute to minute basis. So my question is, if we flip what you're talking about in terms of surveillance, could this actually be a way of supporting employees and some of the human things that we need, arguing from the labor side?
Yeah, so let me try to take this briefly because I'm not good at being brief. So yeah, I think there's the potential for this, but I think, again, and this is my background, but I think you got to think about what the incentives are. And you have to think about, a real sort of more equilibrium analysis of what's going to likely realistically happen if you do this. And so again, I think, if this is going to drive, if basically, taking policies that make people's lives better is going to drive, companies out of business, then it's probably not going to end up being systematic. If it is something that makes people happier to be there and more productive, then I think it will. I'll just give you a brief example. So some friends and I wrote an HBS case on this company, Union Square Hospitality Group in New York. And the founder is from St. Louis, Danny Meyer, believes very, very strongly that tipping is a bad thing, which it is. Tipping is a very, very bad system that's discriminatory and exploitative. There are a whole bunch of things, but so he abolished tipping in his restaurants, and everyone's like, "Oh, this is going to totally work." But if you step back and you think about this from kind of an equilibrium analysis, you think about what is everybody's response functions going to be. You realize pretty quickly that if you try to take on these policy changes unilaterally, it doesn't work. And so I think this needs to be a much broader policy discussion about what we want the nature of work to be, because in a capitalist system, if survival is based on who has the lowest cost, I mean, look at Amazon, right? I mean, everybody buys from Amazon, even though they acknowledge that their work practices are awful. I think until people are actually willing to pay for quality of life, or we can get some sort of broader policy rules, I don't see how in a competitive environment this is going to improve, frankly, unless culture changes the nature of labor. I mean, we see things are much better in Europe, right? So maybe the US can be more like Europe.
Awesome. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I think Matthew, you had a comment, or Thomas, you had your hand up earlier, right? Is that?
Yeah, my internet died. I'm sorry. I have a question to all the panelists, because we're talking about socially oriented sectors. So imagine we're trying to scale up like healthcare and education. A lot of the technologies that do that commoditize workers. So we're commoditizing faculty by doing hybrid learning. We may be commoditizing doctors by doing hybrid consultancy. So how do you see this trade-off between commoditizing workers and reduced value capture for workers, but also the broader societal benefits that can arise when you cater to more students or more people who need healthcare services?
That definitely occurred to me listening to Jerry. So there is this, he made this point that to be honest, I wonder when I sit down at a restaurant and I do the QR code, it's like, why am I not just ordering this way? And, on the one hand, potentially we're putting a lot of service staff out of work. On the other hand, potentially we're reallocating them to other things. And ultimately, productivity growth is kind of taking people out of reasonably low value work and pushing them into higher value work. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a tension there. And I think I'm probably, and this is the first time I've ever said this, I'm probably slightly less pessimistic than some of the other panelists on these things. And I think, you do see pushback. I mean, because, and Jerry was talking about, everybody becoming a contractor. We've been saying this for 25 years. So, if you go back to looking at Fast Company, kind of 96, 97, we were saying that. And one of the weird things is that the proportion of people who report being a contractor or an on-call worker or a temp or anything like that in government surveys has stayed the same for the last 25 years. And so I think that, we have this constant dance where we find these ways to commodify labor, and then we discover they don't work. And eventually companies come around and go, we have incredibly high turnover and our workers hate us. Is this necessarily the way that we're going to create value? And so you do tend to see it's slow. You see a lot of companies taking these off equilibrium paths because I think they're cognitively simpler. It is like you get into, like Lamar says, this engineering mindset. But I do think there are forces that push back in terms of eventually somebody goes, it'd be nice if our attrition rate was less than 150%. I wonder what's going on there. And so, I think it's going to be messy, but there are some improvements that happen as well.
I want to be more pessimistic than Matthew, if I could. So, I mean, one of the problems with
mental health.
Yeah. One of the problems with the data on tempiness is that we collect data in the wrong way, so that it's really hard to tell how many people are actually holding these occupations. So I pushed this link to a recent article in The Verge, which is amazing, saying there's 65,000 delivery drivers in New York. Turns out if you want to be a delivery bicycle rider, rather, you have to buy a $2,000 electric bike because the demands are so high for speed that it's a serious capital investment. That brings out thieves that prey on these people to steal their electric bicycles. And so they're forming their own crypto guild to sort of protect themselves. But I don't think we really know. So the problem is that the job is being designed not by the people who do the work. It's not that you and I design what administering midterm exams online should look like. It's software engineers who don't live in that world. And so the reason why retail work is so horrible, the reason why warehouse work is so horrible is it's not being designed, it's being designed by Wharton graduates who have never actually worked at retail. And so things that look really good on paper, what if we only pay people for the opening and closing 2 hours and send them home in the middle? Like, they will design systems that look like that because it looks cheap. But the people designing organizations aren't even business professors. They're people that know how to write software code. It's sort of Accenture and its ilk that are creating the job designs. And that's why we're going to end up with a world where all restaurants are staffed by nothing but interoperable temps who wander from one to another, depending on where they're available, and they put in bids for shifts. So cheap wins in capitalism, even if it's slightly less good, according to Clay Christensen, slightly less good, but a lot cheaper often wins. So I think that's kind of where we're headed.
Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe if I can follow up on that, because I am doing a study in which we are looking at healthcare aid workers. These people visit patients at their homes, and this is something that has been growing a lot, especially during the pandemic, because people don't want to visit hospitals and stuff like that. And to me, it has been super interesting because, Jerry, very much as you were saying, there were some schedulers that were deciding the schedule, maximizing, optimizing the time based on the demand needs without really taking into account any of the workers' needs. These are low-skilled workers, right? Not necessarily nurses. They are probably replaceable to some extent, but then eventually the company realized that they have taken this model way to the limit, and workers decided sometimes not to show up to work, and this has tremendous consequences for the patients. And also patients' quality, the service that they were getting, right? The quality of the service also decreased a lot. So they were complaining a lot. So, for me, what is interesting is that, the only reason why I'm doing this study is because the operations manager of the company was really concerned about what is going on in my company. And what was interesting is that I was asking, well, how much benefits do you give? How much do you pay? They are extremely limited with this. It's a Canadian organization, so they cannot really increase the fees that they charge into the customer. So who is going to pay for that? But then now they are realizing the limits of this model. So it may be one of these, off equilibrium. I want to think about this way also. I tend to be more optimistic than Matthew in general, but this off equilibrium, right, model that eventually they realize that maybe it doesn't work. The question is that maybe it takes really, too long for companies to find out about this, and how long can they survive with this? So it's just like more a reflection than a question, actually.
Thank you so much, Rocio. We're actually out of time. We're 2 minutes past schedule. So we can definitely, for those of us still interested, to stay behind for a little more discussion. But I want to take the opportunity to thank our panelists very much for their insights today. Thank you for joining us. It's been really, really great. And I've taken away a lot of interesting questions for future research, which was also, at least in part, the goal of the session. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to Victoria and Alenka for bringing us all together.
Thank you very much, everyone.